Because if we
Are we recording?
perfect. Perfect. If we kick off quickly, I want to actually see if we can finish the period today. We can actually finish the period. Yeah, I want to finish today. 48.4.
What do you think, Jed?
What?
40B1. 40B1.
I prefer another one, the proper 12.
Yeah. 40B1. 40
proper 12.
If you've got an art scroll, it's 40B1 left-hand side. For those with an art scroll, 40B1 left-hand side. It says the Gemora elaborates on Rav's ruling that the fatty innards of a fish in roe may be bought only from an expert. And then we're gonna. It's just the last few lines of last time's shiur in Einsha Mumche Mai. What do you do if there is no expert? 40B1 left-hand side, and then in the Steinsalz. You've got it. Okay, that should be about 3 or 4 lines from the top over there. You got it. Let me get the spotlight. There we go. Is everybody got it?
Fourth line from the top of the page.
Fourth line from the top of the page. So L'chaim, and welcome to Ivan, first time. Lovely to have you. And once again, L'chaim for the nishot, your mom, your aunt, your late wife on Chof Daled, and all those that have your sides.
Stephen Jacobson.
Dalman
Melech ben Meir.
Stephen Jacobson. Zalman Melech ben Meir. And then there's also
My wife
what's Devora?
Devora.
Devora Bat Siva.
Was the treatment.
Devora Bat Svia. The 20th of Av, before I forget, also is the Yortzat of the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Leili Yitzchak Schneerson. And although tonight's already of Aleph, tonight's already 21, but the Rebbe would always commemorate the holy days the night after. That was the general style. The Verbrennens, the gatherings, would always take place the night after the day, and he often would mention that the night is connected to the day as well. In other words, although we normally say that the night before is the same date, but the night after has a connection to the day as well. Because in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the avodah, the service that they did in the Beis HaMikdash was done first in the morning and then afterwards the evening, going into the night. So, here's Cousin Brian, perfect timing. We're about to kick off. So last time, I'm going to shoot. I'm going to get going because I want to get to the end of the period. So last time we were talking about how to identify whether or not the innards of fish are kosher. Remember, we spoke about the intestines, the more loose innards. We spoke about the roe, which means the fish eggs. So it's got to do, actually, the funny thing is it's very tangential. That's always how come that worried about wine. The main discussion started out with wine, which was often used for avodah zarah, for wine, for libations. And once the Gemora was talking about prohibited wine, it moved on to talk about prohibited fish and various other foods and items that are not allowed, because we can't trust the people who are giving it to us, whether or not it's kosher. But it's a good question. It's typical of Gemora to move in a tangential way all over the place. And the Gemora had said in the part that we did last time that if you want to buy fish innards, caviar, roe, you need to buy them from a mumcha, from an expert. And the Mefarshim, the commentaries on the Gemora had explained that an expert here doesn't only mean expertise, that the person knows what they're talking about, but it also means someone who's trustworthy, because you need two things. You need a person that understands that these innards come from a specific fish. With a kosher fish, remember we said the general rule is that the eggs that come from a kosher animal kosher. So these must be eggs that come from a kosher fish. If you want to know if it's kosher caviar, it must come from a kosher fish. The same thing with the innards. But what about if the fish is not around? You're only seeing the innards. You know, often things were sold in the marketplace, and it could be that this particular fellow has a stall, and at his stall, his speciality, he sells only eggs, and fish innards. So you can't see which fish it's coming from. They're not in front of your eyes, and they're not in front of his eyes. And the Gemora had said that if you have somebody who's defined as a mumcha, which means an expert, but in this case it means a trustworthy expert, then you're allowed to believe him that these eggs come from a kosher species, a kosher fish, that these innards or intestines come from a kosher fish, and you're allowed to eat them. And then the Gemora had asked, what happens if there's no expert? If there's no trustworthy expert, it's an ordinary guy. He doesn't know a lot. He doesn't know how to analyze all these different species. He's an ordinary fellow. On the other hand, if he can assure you that he knows exactly what kind of fish it was that this stuff comes from, or he saw the fish himself, he originally bought the fish itself, then it could be okay also. So the Gemara asked, Im ein shamumche mai, what's the rule? And then the Gemara brought a machloikas, a difference of opinion between and Rav Nachman. Rav Yehuda and Rav Nachman with regard to shoot. What was, oh, you need to see that fish. According to Rav Yehuda, you don't have to see the fish. As long as the fish salted the fish, it means he saw it, it's good enough. Rav Nachman says, no, you have to actually see the fish. He has to say, I salted the fish, and here it is. So reading it inside. Yeah. If there's no mumcha, like a mashkiach. My. Amar Rav Yehuda said, Kivan the Amar ani melachtim. Since he said, I salted the fish, mutarin, it's permissible, even if you don't see the fish. Rav Nachman is stricter. Ad sheyoymar, till he says, Eilu dogim, I've got both for you. Here is the fish, Eilu kirvayim, and here is the innards of the fish. So you've got this argument whether the expert, not the expert, whether this is the ordinary fellow that has to show you the fish and the innards. And then the Gemara says that Rav Yehuda was very strong about his opinion that you don't fish enough to see the fish. So in fact, Rabbi Yehuda taught and showed his attendant, his servant, whose name was Ada, and he said, if the person says, I salted the fish, it's good enough. We don't have to worry that he should show you the actual fish. The fact that he says, I salted it is good enough, because the concept is we don't believe that a tradesman, Gemora always weighs up. To what extent is a tradesman going to lie? Why should he run his reputation a risk over telling you that it came from a particular fish, and the truth is it's not so? So we are prepared to trust, according to Rav Yehuda. And in fact, we often allude to the halacha, especially the Steinsaltz has it in the corner notes to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. I think the Art Scroll would do it also in certain cases. And if one looks at the halacha does rule, according to Rav Yehuda, that it's not necessary to see the fish. If the person who saw the fish himself tells you that he saw the kosher fish that these eggs came from, it's allowed. And interestingly enough, in this case, even if, according to halacha, if I read it right, even if it's a Gentile fish merchant, if he's very clear about where they came from and that he knows and he saw that fish, we consider it that that's where the innards or the eggs of the came from. Yeah. Yeah. Now.
So why wouldn't that apply to meat as well then?
Sorry?
Why is meat so much?
Meat is much stricter because meat has all the laws of shchita, of slaughter. So it's not just whether it's kosher or not.
Why the trust factor is not there either?
Sorry?
The trust factor obviously on meat is not the same.
The trust factor is not the same at all with meat because meat has much more rules and restrictions. Don't forget that if a fish is pulled out the water and it's a kosher fish, you can walk off with it.
Yeah.
But meat, only a Jew who's a shochet can slaughter it. Then it has to be kashed, it has to be kosher, and it has to be checked. There could be all kinds of issues when you open up the animal. The lungs have to be checked to see if it's glut. The species could be an issue. Sometimes you can get birds which are kosher and some which aren't. So meat is a whole extra situation, a whole extra story. Yeah, yeah,
Because meat that kosher and the same one is not kosher because something was wrong inside.
yeah,
I'm saying the factor of the trust, not
yeah,
the
yeah.
number.
There's a lot
If
that
you
could go
speak
wrong
up
in
and
meat.
be like, if he's kosher, I must believe you.
Yeah,
No, but
yeah.
if there is a much gear, it comes to meat, you
Not
cannot
with fish.
But Ivan is right. With meat, the trust level is
Talking about
lower.
Trust.
That's why
Must believe you.
the trust level is lower
That's
with
right.
meat, and that's why it has to be double sealed. You know, if you dispatch meat with a Gentile, with somebody that's not Jewish, for delivery to somebody else, it has to be double sealed. In order, you have to have a double seal in order that it should be considered kosher when it gets to the other side. Anyway, the next thing is the Gemora analyzes the next subject in the Mishnah. If you remember, in an earlier Mishnah, sure. In an earlier Mishnah, the Gemara spoke about a sharp spice called chiltis. It said the things we about is chil that has been cut. I'm not 100% sure exactly which one it is, but it's, similar, imagine, to ginger or turmeric or these kind of root spices. Sorry? It sounds like crane. It sounds similar to crane, but the commentaries on the Gemara are not 100% sure what the modern day version of this food, that the spicy root food that the Mishnah calls hiltit or chiltis. But in another Mishnah, the Tanoim had ruled that chiltis cannot be bought from Gentiles because generally it was sold in slices. Maybe it was a big root and they would cut it up. And we were worried that they would cut it up with a treif knife. Sure. One of the problems with sharp things is that they are much sharper in the knife. So if one used a knife that wasn't a knife, that would be absorbed, even though normally we think of fruits and vegetables. Said that the roots of chiltis, the actual knob or whatever you call it, the flesh of this particular, sorry? The bulb, yeah. The bulb of this root, which would be like, let's say, if we're calling it like horseradish, the actual, it looks like a carrot or the root. The
Onion.
yeah, the actual flesh of it would be a problem because of the fact that we worried about how it was cut. 1 second, let's get this thing out the way. Now, that was what the previous Mishnah said, that we don't, because the Gemara was discussing various different generic foods and whether they can or cannot be bought from Gentiles. So if you're in the marketplace, you can't buy chiltit from a Gentile because you have to worry, how did he cut these slices or slithers of this chiltis? But this Mishnah had said that the leaves of the same plant are okay. In other words, the plant was good for its leaves and good for its roots. And this Mishnah that we learned more recently said the leaves are okay. It's a dibur maskil. The Gemara is quoting the phrase from the Mishnah in listing things that are okay to buy from a Gentile. This Mishnah had said the leaf of the chiltis plant is permitted. The Gemara wants to know why teach the obvious. Surely, I mean, what could be with a leaf? Shitta, that's obvious. Why do I need to know that the leaf of the chiltis plant is okay to buy from a non-Jew? A leaf is a plant. So the Gemara explains, no nitzrachah, it is necessary to affirm, to verify. Why? Because of the slivers of that sometimes stick to the leaf. What happens, the way this plant grows, particles of the flesh to the leaves. And you would wonder if the sages had a problem with the slivers in general. Maybe they have a problem with the sliver leaf. Mal de Taima Am thought, we should worry. Dilma Maisum Arabay. Imagine that selling this kind of spice in cut pieces with the leaves, and he wants to tell you the two together. Now, the cut pieces from the root are a problem. We banned them. We said they're prohibited because they might have been used. Now they're mixed with the leaves. Mashmalon, the Mishnah wanted to teach you that these are not a problem. You know why? The whole it got stuck on the leaf together with it. In other words, it was a growth issue. The plant was growing, particles from the roots stuck on the leaf, and when the leaf was ripped or cut off, those particles stuck to it. So they have nothing to do with something that a human cut. So just because cut slivers of chiltis are a problem, it doesn't mean that slivers of chiltis that stuck to the leaf are a problem. And that's why this Mishnah found it necessary to confirm that chiltis leaves are okay. That it doesn't particles from the chiltis root are still okay. Then the Gemora said, it spoke about olives. Now, olives are sold in olives in a brine. There's all different ways in which olives are sold. So the Gemora had, now, as a way of introduction, one of the things that the Gemora was dealing with was you get different foods that are preserved in different ways. Don't forget, they never had fridges in those days. So everything had and different foods preserved or pickled differently. And where it was common, and this is how we came to Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah is about wine, because wine a lot in rituals, in libations, in Avodah Zarah. So therefore, almost anything that was known to have wine as a ingredient would become a problem. Anything, the moment wine is a major ingredient, and wine doesn't have to mean the actual wine. It could mean the wine vinegar, the balsamic vinegar, or any type for wine in a food. So if we knew something that the Goy and the Gentiles prepare using wine as an ingredient or sprinkling wine, that would be a problem. So the Mishnah said that the different ways that olives were preserved and sold, and some of the olive recipes were obviously had a threat of wine. So this Mishnah had said, this Mishnah had said, cakes of olives that are rolled olive cakes. One of the ways that they sold olives is they would take the olives and they would imagine, I mean, pitted olives here, and they would roll it into like a stuck kind of olives. And what that said is that these rolled olive cakes, like rolled olives, are okay. Why? It would seem that these were not preserved with wine. It was not the recipe of this particular product. Gemora asks the same question. Pshita, shouldn't this be obvious? If they just took plain olive flesh and pressed them and rolled them, what's that got to do? Why would that be prohibited? That the Mishnah has to come and say it's okay. So the Gemora says, La nitzracha, no, you need to tell us. Because I would say, I'll gav the rafa tuva, even though they're very soft. Mal de taimra chamra ramabahu, I would think that maybe he put wine in it or vinegar. I would think that he put wine vinegar there. In other words, why is it so soft? It's soft from wine vinegar. Komash Malon, so this Mishnah came to say, no, Hana Machmas Mishchahu deraf. It's because of their oil that they're soft. These olives have their own inherent olive oil in them. And as they start to ripen, they become very soft from the olive oil that's inside them. They are not soft from the wine vinegar, they're soft from the olive oil. I might have thought they're soft from wine vinegar. I might have therefore thought they're not okay. The Mishnah came to confirm that rolled olive cakes generally are soft because of their own inherent olive oil. However, the same Mishnah said that there's another product called overripe olives, very ripe olives, very fermented olives, we could say, and these are not okay because these generally do have wine vinegar in them. But Rabbi Yossi taught, shlachin asurin, overripe olives, fermented, overripe olives are prohibited. Why? Because the general recipe was that this particular brand of olive that people buy, they were adding wine-based vinegar, and that's how they got it to that stage. So the Gemora wants to know, how do you know what's overripe? I mean, give me an indicator. What's soft? What's ripe? What's super ripe? What does it mean, overripe? Rabbi Yossi Bar Chanina said this is the test. Any olive that when he holds it in his hand, and the pip, or the pit as they call it, in South Africa we say pip, slips out. In other words, it's so soft that if you pick up this olive in your hands, the pit slips out. This is a super ripe olive, and it's so ripe that you know that it's a shlachin. It's one of the type that Rabbi Yossi says is not allowed because it is prepared with wine-based vinegar. That was the olives. Then the Gemora is unpacking what the Mishnah said. Of the last items in that Mishnah, the Mishnah spoke about locusts, kosher locusts. There are certain locusts which are kosher. And it spoke about locusts and caper buds. Caper buds, similar to, they look like olives, but it's a different vegetable. Those very strong little bulby kind of things. And leeks. These are also different items that in many cases, the Gentiles or anybody that prepares them will sprinkle in wine. So again, we're worried, what kind of wine did they put in it? Prohibited wine. So here, locusts that come, Tanu Rabbanon, the rabbis taught. Okay, so what that Mishnah had said is what you have to assess is where these locusts that they're selling are coming from. If they come from, here it says chulei, etc., but what the Mishnah had said, the etc. was that it came from a salesman's basket, meaning he has his basket and he fills it up with his wares. You know, some people in the marketplace are sitting at a stand, they've got a booth. Other people are going around shouting, they're circulating and peddling their stuff. They've got a basket with the stuff inside it. The Mishnah had said if those locusts are already in the peddler's basket, they're no good. Reason being that the custom was to sprinkle wine on them, but they only sprinkled the wine on them at the last minute, because if the wine was on it for too long, it would perish. And if it perishes, then the guy loses his stock. What happens if he doesn't sell that day? Now, overnight, it's not going to last. He can't sell it the next day. So the way they used to work is what they were about to sell, they sprinkled wine on it. Then, but what was back in the storeroom, they didn't sprinkle wine. So if you were buying it and you could see that it came from the storeroom, it was okay. But if it was coming from the basket that he's walking around with, then probably he already sprinkled wine. The rabbis taught. So the Gemora quotes a similar passage, which is similar to that one in the Brisa. All these three things, locusts and caper buds and leeks. If they came from Oitzer and Heftek, are both types of storerooms. One is a bigger warehouse, one's a smaller storeroom. If it comes from the warehouse or the storeroom or the ship, it was brought in a load on a ship. I don't know if they had containers in those days, but they do speak of shiploads, which would be stock that came from far. From the ship, mutarin, these are permissible, meaning at this stage nobody's adding any kind of wine because they wouldn't want to destroy it. Hanim korin bekatluza, those sold in the market, lifnei chenvani, right in front of the merchant. He's standing there selling it to you. He imagines you're going to pop it in your mouth to taste it. He's already spiced it. Asurin, those are prohibited, because he sprinkles wine on them. his treif non-kosher wine. So that basically is the litmus test. How far back in chain of storage is it? The commentaries on the Gemora, like Rashi, Tosfos, all of them say that the way it works is there were different, in the economic chain, there were different levels of distribution. There's the big warehouse, and from the big warehouse, it gets sold to people who put it in a smaller storeroom. From the small storeroom, it goes to the shop, and the shopkeeper moves it from the back to the front. And basically, what the Mefarshim on the Gemora say is each time it moves closer to the end user, as we call it, there's a greater risk that there's wine poured on it, because wine makes it tasty and ready to sell. In other words, the Mefarshim explain that the risk of wine is increased as the storage moves closer to the point of sale. In other words, the big warehouse is safer than the small storeroom, and the small storeroom is safer than the back of the shop, and the back of the shop is safer than the front of the shop. However, says the Gemora, the rabbis took a view that anything besides for the last point is okay. In other words, they wanted to make a something that the people could cope with. You can't just walk around prohibiting everything. So they decided that they would only prohibit, for the risk of wine having been sprinkled on it, that's not kosher wine, they would only prohibit the place of last point of sale. In other words, either the basket that the peddler's walking around with, or if he's like a deli, you know, when you go to a deli with your plates and they're scooping, and they're scooping from the last place where they're about to sell to eat. So from there, we are worried about wine being added. Obviously, we're talking lahavdil about a non-Jewish merchant. A Jewish merchant you trust. A non-Jewish merchant at the last point of sale, that's where you're worried about the wine being added. And on a similar vein, the Gemora moves. Some time to finish. Gemora moves on the similar concept to a concept called wine that's made from other fruits, not from grapes, which actually we don't technically call it wine in English. It's more, I know people think of apple cider as apple ties or a drink. The real meaning of apple cider actually is like the alcohol beverage, fermented apple. You get that in certain places, like a fermented apple drink. And you can get, rice wine. And from rice, exactly, rice wine, you get wines from different fruit. Now, the issue over here is, well, not the issue, the challenge is grapes, because if you know for sure that there's no grapes added, the gezerah, the decree that our rabbis made against wine from Gentiles does not apply to alcoholic beverages made from grains and other fruit, which is why this guy is okay. Which is why these guys are okay. The problem is grapes. Now, the Gemora says that there was a time that what the merchants would do is, even if it was a fruit wine, towards the end, they would add a bit of grape wine just to give it a bit of a kick. There was a risk that the ingredient of grape wine, I'm saying grape wine, that's what wine is normally when we think of wine, but wine made from grapes would be added to the apple cider or any other kind of fermented drink that there was. And the question was, how do we deal with that risk? And the Gemora takes a very similar view to the view we just had with the locusts and the leeks and the capers. The view is that even though it helps to add grape wine, it does help apple ciders and other alcoholic beverages, it only helps right at the end. If you add it just before drinking, you can, how do you call it? You can mix a cocktail. But if you start putting grape wine into apple cider too long before, then you actually stuff up the drink. You mess it up. And no merchant is going to mess up his own stock. No factory is going to destroy their own stock. So there we come back to the same principle. Same stock, if it's further away from the point of sale, it's safer. And if it's right there where he's trying to sell it in the marketplace, you're worried about pouring in here. So here it is in the words of the Gemora. V'chein yain tapuchim. Likewise, he calls it the wine of apples, apple cider. Shall oived kichavim, that comes from Gentiles, haboyin mina oitzerum mina hefteik umina slulam mutarim, that which is drawn from the warehouse, from the storeroom, and even from the baskets is permissible. Hanimkar b'katlev, in a basket in the marketplace, asur, that's prohibited. You know why? Because at the last minute, they mix wine to it at the last minute, and the risk of the wine getting mixed in happens right at the end. Based on this, the Gemora tells us a story. The sages said a story about apple cider and wine. Pam achas, one time, Chosh Rebbe b'Meyav. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, the great sage who compiled the his stomach was sore. Amar, he said, Klum yesh adam sheyodeya yain tapuchim shel evdi kachavim asur emut. Anybody who knows, I need some information. Anyone who knows about apple cider made by non-Jews, made by Gentiles, is it allowed or not allowed? In other words, Rebbe felt that an old, very fermented apple cider would help him with his stomach ailments. But he wanted to know if anybody has experience. How do they make it? And is there any maseres? Is there any tradition? Is it okay? Omar lefon of Rabbi Shmuel but Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shmuel but Rabbi Yossi said to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, my own father one time had a stomach ailment. They brought him apple cider made by Gentiles, shall ayin shan of 70 years, 70 years apple cider, v'shasov blankets, and he became cured. It cured him. Amalai, Rebbe said to Rabbi Shmuel, but Rabbi Yossi, kol kach haya b'yadcha v'atom tzareni. I'm suffering, and you waited to tell me this. I had to walk around looking for an answer. I had to Google this. Why didn't you come to me right away and tell me that I could have it? That's the story that the Gemora tells. If you knew that your father did this and it worked, and you knew that it was okay, you should have told me earlier. I would have suffered this. They went and checked. They found the Gentile. They found a particular Gentile had a stock of 300 large jugs of apple cider, shel ayin shana, which was 70 years aged. V'shasov and Isrape, Rabbi Yehuda, from this fellow's apple cider, and he became cured. Amar, he said, a prayer of thanks to Hashem, Baruch HaMakim, blessed is God, Shemosar Elamei L'Shemim, who gave his world over to God, to gods. In other words, he praised Hashem for having the wisdom to have people like this particular fellow that put away the good stuff for 70 years, so that when a man like him is sick and so he has where to turn to. You know, if you don't have a man that's going to put the stuff away for 70 years, then, you know, that's a long preparation span. You're not going to have it ready for when you need it. Yeah.
That's the way to start. To hear you guys.
And we have 3, 4, 5, 6, just a few more lines. So let's catch those few lines before we finish up. The Mishnah had said at the end an interesting expression. It spoke about all these different food items that are either okay or not okay. And it ended off with an interesting statement. V'chein truma, and the same rules apply to truma. Truma is what? The special food that the Kohanim were given. The Israelites would deduct or take a amount of their agricultural produce, and they would donate it to the priests, to the Kohanim in the temple, that they should be able to eat it. And that was called truma. And a truma, besides for being a type of sustenance for the Kohanim, it was a holy food. It had special rules to do with it. In other words, the Kohanim had to be pure when they ate it. It was what's called kodshim. It was called holy, and they were only allowed to eat it, and their families could eat it. A zar, meaning someone who's not a kohen, wasn't allowed to eat it. And there were all kinds of rules concerning truma. Now here the Mishnah says, v'chein truma, the same rules we just said in this Mishnah about all these foods from the back of the shop and the front of the shop, and maybe applies to the truma of the kohenim. So what does the Mishnah mean? That sounds a bit cryptic. What does all of that got to do with the truma that the Kohanim received from the rest of Bnei Yisrael, the Israelites? So the Gemora asks, "My v'chayni truma." What does it mean? And also truma. Amar Rav Sheshes, so Rav Sheshes, the Gemora explains it. Let me just say it outside, then we'll read it inside. The idea was the following: that the Kohanim would receive truma from the people. Generally, spiritually, the truma was of a higher standard and had special rules. But unfortunately, in the marketplace, value-wise, the truma fell in price below the regular food. Anybody want to take a guess why? Because when you go out to sell it, you can only sell it to Kohanim. You can't sell it to everybody. So if you can't sell it to everybody, your market is smaller, the price drops. So ironically, although truma had a very high value in Kedusha, if a Kohen wanted to make a few bob, he had some accounts to pay, so he wanted to sell some of his truma, there weren't a lot of big market to buy it. He could only sell it to fellow Kohanim. So what happened was, the price of truma ironically dropped in the market below the price of chulin, of regular food. So he is allowed to sell it to fellow Kohanim, who were allowed to eat it. But nevertheless, it could be that somebody else wanted his truma. Maybe he had the caviar, the other guy didn't, He had the smoked salmon, he had the good stuff. So he sells it to another Kohen, but he can't sell it to an Israelite. Therefore, what happened is the price of truma dropped below the price of chulin. Because of that,
Sell it to a non-Jew.
no, you can't do that. Not allowed to do that. Would desecrate it. Not allowed to do that. So now you had a very interesting situation. You could have Kohanim who were not scrupulous, who were naughty, exactly, and maybe they would say that it's chulin even though it isn't. In other words, they would fib and they would say that this food is not truma, so that more people would be in the market to buy it. But you had to be careful because, like anybody, unfortunately, there can be some people who present themselves as holy or religious, and they do naughty things. So me and you, we have to be careful who we're buying from and what we're buying from. So basically what the rabbi said is that the idea was that if the Kohen was selling the truma in public, right in front of the shop, in other words, in front of everybody he's selling it, then we could be sure that it is okay. That it is really chulin, because he'd be scared to sell it openly and publicly if it isn't. But if it's coming from the storehouse, the risk is bigger, because in the storehouse, it's possible, to use the back door. Not everybody knows, and it's not for sure going to be a reputational problem. So v'chein l'truma, the Gemara explains, my v'chein l'truma, what does it mean, similar rules for truma? Oh, my Rav Sheshes said, v'chein l'kohen, likewise a kohen. And unfortunately, some of them, not all of them, because most kohenim are not chashudim, that means not suspected. A kohen who was suspected, we didn't have evidence, but he was known to be suspected of selling his truma as if it was chulin. He wanted the market price. He wanted to make money. So he was suspected of selling his truma as chulin. The one of who the asur, sorry, I got it the wrong way around. It's the other way around. If it is bought in front of him, it is asur, it is prohibited. But if it came from the storeroom or the warehouse or the basket, mutar, it would be permissible. Why? Because irtus emeritus. Because over there, if he's selling it from his storeroom, he's afraid. Savar shama beirabonon. He would say, look, it sounds like I'm managing to do it quiet from the back. But what happens if others hear, and I lose? In other words, what could happen is I could get a ban slapped on me. I could get them coming out and saying, hold on a second, don't give this guy your truma, because he goes and he sells it as chulin. So there, and it seems, I'm trying to figure out exactly why, but it seems that the storeroom, the warehouse, was the higher risk and the place where he'd be afraid to finagle, to make trouble. But out in front, the truma that was for sale in the front, over there, he might not be as worried about doing a switch and calling it chulin. So that's what these Tanoim were saying in the Mishnah, that the same way we measure whether or not the non-kosher wine was put in from whether it is in the back storeroom or the front. The same happens with the Kohen and his truma. When it's in the front, we worry about it. When it's in the back storeroom, we're not worried because we worry that he will worry about his whole big storehouse can be declared invalid and treif. And that brings us to the end of the perek. So we say, Hadron Aloch Ein Ma'amidin. May we return to you, perek Ein Ma'amidin. Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Simon tov. Simon tov. Mazel tov. Mazel tov. Simon tov.
Wow. Shkoyach, Rav.
Time, everybody. Time.
L'chaim.
Gentlemen, that means 36 pages to the end of Avodah Zarah. We're more than halfway.
Shkoyach, shkoyach.
It's bringing new volumes next.
What the?
Won't you have a proper next?
We will have one, but please, I think maybe we'll wait till it warms up a bit. We made a CM once at my place back yonder. We're going to do another. After, I think, for you to get warmer summary, and then one Monday night I'll work it out with Michael. We'll make one we'll make a.
It'll be nice.
Yeah, let's see him at our place. Like just after Simchas Torah, because all the year comes to a close.
Nice, so good.
Yeah.
Sure, come before.
Okay, call to Rav. All the best. Zaki Zin.
Sure. If I do Ashkenazi.